Pulling off a hostage rescue thousands of miles from home sounds like the plot of an action movie, but in 1976, Israel's commandos turned that fantasy into reality. After hijackers diverted an Air France flight to Entebbe, Uganda, where dictator Idi Amin was basically their hype man, the IDF loaded 4 massive C-130 transport planes and embarked on a 4,000-kilometer night flight that would make any pilot's palms sweaty. Their secret weapon? A fake motorcade featuring a black Mercedes and Land Rovers designed to look exactly like Amin's personal convoy, allowing them to roll up to the terminal like they owned the place. The plan called for hitting the building hard, freeing the hostages, and securing the runway before anyone could scramble Uganda's fighter jets. Everything was going smoothly until a Ugandan sentry got suspicious and challenged the convoy. Amin had recently upgraded to a white Mercedes, making the Israeli decoy suddenly very obvious. When gunfire erupted earlier than planned, the commandos had to sprint toward the terminal, knowing the hijackers inside could execute hostages any second. Once inside, Israeli soldiers shouted commands in Hebrew and English, yelling, "Stay down!" to help separate terrified passengers from armed terrorists during the chaos. The entire ground operation lasted just 90 minutes, a razor-thin window that left zero room for mistakes. Unit Commander Yonatan Netanyahu was killed in action. Several hostages died in the crossfire, and dozens of Ugandan soldiers lost their lives defending the airport. The risks went beyond the firefight itself. Israeli planes had to refuel in Kenya without official permission, and one wrong calculation could have left the entire force stranded in hostile territory. Before departing, commandos destroyed Ugandan MiG fighters parked on the tarmac to prevent aerial pursuit during their escape. Amin responded to the embarrassment by executing anyone suspected of helping the Israelis, but the damage to his reputation was already done. European counterterrorism units studied Entebbe's tactics for years afterward, adopting similar approaches for their own hostage situations. The operation proved that determined forces could project power anywhere on the planet when lives hung in the balance, establishing a template that special operations teams still reference today. When 6 armed terrorists stormed the Iranian embassy in London's posh Kensington neighborhood, they probably weren't expecting their takedown to become a live television spectacle watched by millions. The SAS had been planning their assault for days, splitting into red and blue teams that would rappel from the roof, blow through windows with explosives, and clear rooms one by one in what they hoped would be a textbook operation. For nearly a week, negotiators stalled while commandos studied building layouts and rehearsed every possible scenario. The whole thing was supposed to be surgical, quick, and clean. Then everything started falling apart at once. One SAS operator got tangled in his abseil rope, dangling uselessly outside while his teammates moved into position. A window broke earlier than planned, immediately alerting the gunman inside that something was going down. When explosive charges detonated, curtains caught fire and badly burned one trooper, turning the careful timeline into pure chaos. The decision to launch had come only after terrorists executed a hostage and dumped his body outside, forcing the British government to hand control from police negotiators to the SAS. Once that trigger was pulled, there was no backing out. Red and blue teams hit the building from multiple entry points at the same time, flooding rooms with stun grenades and smoke while cameras outside captured the dramatic assault for viewers glued to their TVs. Inside, commandos had seconds to identify who was a hostage and who was holding a gun. A life-or-death sorting process happening in smoke-filled rooms. 5 terrorists were killed during the assault, with only one taken alive for interrogation. All but one of the remaining hostages walked out breathing, though some were injured during the firefight. PC Trevor Locke, a police officer who had been held captive the entire siege, became a national hero for his calm under pressure. The Iranian embassy siege changed British counterterrorism forever. Watching black-clad SAS operators storm a building in broad daylight on live television sent a message that Britain wouldn't negotiate with hostage takers, and other nations took notes. The tactics and procedures developed during Operation Nimrod became the foundation for CT units worldwide, proving that speed, surprise, and overwhelming force could end hostage situations before terrorists had time to react. French commandos don't usually get the same Hollywood treatment as their American or British counterparts, but GIGN proved they belonged in the conversation when they tackled one of the most dangerous hostage rescues ever attempted. 4 heavily armed terrorists hijacked Air France Flight 8969 in Algiers with a plan that made everyone's blood run cold. Fly the fuel-loaded Airbus A300 to Paris and crash it into the Eiffel Tower, killing everyone aboard plus potentially thousands on the ground. French authorities convinced Algerian officials to let the plane refuel in Marseille instead, buying precious time while GIGN operators trained on an identical A300, memorizing every inch of the aircraft's layout. They even staged a fake press conference as a distraction, convincing hijackers to move hostages toward the back of the plane and away from the initial breach points. The assault hit complications immediately. Boarding stairs didn't align properly with the aircraft doors because of suspension differences nobody had accounted for during during planning, forcing commandos to adjust their approach on the fly. Terrorists opened fire through the fuselage with automatic weapons while lobbing grenades in the cramped cabin, creating a nightmare scenario where one wrong move could kill dozens of innocent people. GIGN operators launched their assault from 3 different stairs simultaneously, isolating the cockpit while engaging hijackers in a brutal 20-minute firefight that shredded the aircraft's interior. All 4 terrorists were killed before they could detonate the explosives packed throughout the cabin, and passengers were evacuated through emergency exits while smoke still filled the plane. The stakes had been raised days earlier when hijackers executed 3 passengers in Algiers, demonstrating they had zero hesitation about killing hostages. That violence forced French officials to authorize the assault rather than risk more deaths or the catastrophic Paris attack. GIGN's success created the modern playbook for aircraft assaults in close-quarters combat, showing other nations how to breach a plane without turning it into a flying coffin. Air France immediately suspended all flights to Algeria for the next 10 years, and airlines worldwide overhauled their security protocols. The operation proved that even the most dangerous hostage situation could be resolved with proper training, but the margin for error was razor thin when fighting terrorists inside a metal tube packed with jet fuel. Patience isn't usually the first word that comes to mind when you think about hostage rescues, but Peruvian commandos spent months playing the long game during the 1997 Japanese embassy siege in Lima. 14 MRTA terrorists had stormed a holiday party and taken hundreds of diplomats and government officials hostage, settling in for what they assumed would be a lengthy negotiation. While talks dragged on above ground, Peruvian special forces were literally digging their way to victory, constructing elaborate tunnels beneath the ambassador's residence that would let them pop up inside the building like the world's most dangerous game of whack-a-mole. Engineers worked in shifts to muffle the sound of excavation, knowing that one careless noise could alert the heavily armed captors above and turn the hostages into human shields. The operation faced serious obstacles that could have turned the rescue into a massacre. Structural engineers worried that drilling noise would give away their position, so they coordinated digging with loud music played during hostage exercise periods to mask the sound. MRTA fighters had wired the building with booby traps, and some wore explosive vests, meaning any premature breach could trigger detonations that would collapse entire sections of the residence. Snipers positioned in surrounding buildings tracked every movement inside through windows, feeding intelligence to commanders while preparing to take out specific targets the moment the assault began. After 126 days of captivity, commandos launched their attack by simultaneously blowing multiple tunnel exit points inside the building, catching terrorists completely off guard. Hostage takers who had grown comfortable with their routine suddenly found armed operators emerging from the floor beneath them. Snipers eliminated threats through windows while assault teams moved through rooms, identifying and neutralizing captors before they could react. The majority of the 72 remaining hostages were evacuated safely, though the firefight claimed lives on both sides. One hostage died from a heart attack during the chaos, and 2 commandos were killed in action. The Chavín de Huántar operation became an instant legend in counterterrorism circles, proving that unconventional approaches could crack seemingly impossible situations. Fujimori's government used the successful rescue to bolster its anti-terrorism credentials, though the president himself would later face legal troubles unrelated to the operation. Military academies now study the tunnel assault as a masterclass in patience, deception, and engineering under pressure. The rescue demonstrated that sometimes the best way through a problem is literally underneath it, and that months of careful preparation could be worth more than hours of aggressive tactics. Sometimes the best rescue doesn't involve a single bullet. Colombian intelligence officers spent months crafting an elaborate con job that would make Ocean's 11 look like amateur hour, convincing FARC guerrillas to voluntarily hand over 15 high-value hostages without realizing they'd been played. The setup was brilliantly simple. Fake communications made FARC leadership believe a humanitarian organization wanted to relocate prisoners to a different camp, with international media tagging along to document the transfer. Colombian operators posed as aid workers and journalists, complete with cameras and clipboards, boarding helicopters that FARC fighters assumed were chartered by sympathetic leftist groups. Every detail mattered, from the right accent when speaking Spanish to wearing logos of organizations FARC trusted. The entire scheme balanced on a knife's edge, where one suspicious guard could unravel months of planning. If any FARC security personnel had demanded proper credentials or made a single verification call to their higher-ups, the jig would be up and hostages might pay the price. The fake aircrew had to maintain their cover stories while guerrillas loaded hostages onto the helicopters, acting casual even though their hearts were probably hammering. Among those prisoners was Ingrid Betancourt, a former Colombian presidential candidate who had spent 6 years chained in the jungle, along with 3 American defense contractors held since 2003. FARC fighters casually handed over their most valuable bargaining chips, chatting with the humanitarian workers about weather and flight times. The helicopters lifted off with FARC guerrillas still waving from the ground, completely unaware they'd just been conned out of their prized hostages. Once airborne and safely away, the aid workers revealed their true identities to the stunned prisoners, who couldn't believe they were actually free. The operation succeeded without firing a shot, proving that psychological warfare and information operations could accomplish what bullets and breaches sometimes couldn't. Colombia's military intelligence immediately earned respect from spy agencies worldwide, demonstrating sophistication that many hadn't expected from a nation still fighting an internal insurgency. Operation Jaque shifted the balance of power in Colombia's decades-long conflict with FARC. The guerrilla group lost major leverage when their most prominent hostages disappeared in a single afternoon, and the government gained credibility both domestically and internationally. The rescue showed that deception, when executed flawlessly, beats overwhelming firepower every time. Military planners now study Jaque as proof that the most dangerous weapon in special operations isn't always the one that goes bang. Rescuing hostages from the middle of an active war zone sounds insane, even by special operations standards. But that's exactly what Israeli forces attempted in Gaza's Nuseirat refugee camp during June 2024. 4 hostages were being held in separate apartments, buried deep within densely packed residential buildings, requiring simultaneous raids coordinated down to the second. The IDF, Yamam counterterrorism units, and Shin Bet intelligence officers created an armored corridor through the camp while maintaining an overwhelming air and surveillance presence overhead. Unlike previous operations where stealth was king, this rescue happened in broad daylight with the whole neighborhood watching. Things went sideways almost immediately when extraction vehicles took RPG and heavy machine gun fire, with one getting completely disabled in the street. The fighting was so intense that Israeli forces called in massive airstrikes to suppress enemy fire and create an escape route, leading to disputed casualty figures that sparked international controversy. Palestinian authorities reported hundreds of civilian deaths, while the IDF gave much lower numbers, turning the rescue into a diplomatic firestorm even as it was still happening. Yamam officer Arnon Zamora was killed during the operation, paying the ultimate price to bring the hostages home. All 4 captives made it out alive, including Noah Argamani, whose kidnapping had been captured on video and shared worldwide, making her face synonymous with the hostage crisis. The rescue forced uncomfortable conversations about acceptable costs in hostage situations, with some arguing the mission saved innocent lives, while others questioned whether the collateral damage justified the operation. Military ethicists will debate this one for years, weighing hostage survival against civilian risk in a way that has no clean answers. 10 terrorists armed with assault rifles and grenades turned Mumbai into a battlefield across multiple locations simultaneously, creating a counterterrorism nightmare that would stretch Indian forces to their breaking point. The Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, Oberoi Trident, and Nariman House Jewish Center were all under siege at once, with attackers barricaded inside luxury buildings they'd rigged with explosives. National Security Guard commandos and Marcos Naval Special Forces had to coordinate parallel clearing operations while the whole world watched on live television, which created a problem nobody anticipated. The terrorists were watching those same broadcasts and using them to track security force movements in real time. Media coverage essentially gave attackers a bird's-eye view of Indian tactics until authorities finally killed the feeds partway through the operation. By then, the damage was done and commandos had to adapt their approach while clearing hotels floor by floor, checking every room for IEDs and ambushes. Marcos operators fast-roped from helicopters onto the roof of Nariman House for a dramatic vertical entry, but the close-quarters fighting inside was brutal and methodical. NSG Sergeant Gakinder Singh was killed during the Nariman House assault, one of several security personnel who died rescuing hundreds of trapped civilians from the 3 locations. The sieges dragged on until November 29th, with final clears taking days rather than hours as commandos methodically eliminated threats while trying to minimize additional casualties. India's response exposed critical gaps in urban counterterrorism capabilities, intelligence sharing between agencies, and protocols for managing media during active operations. The attacks forced a complete overhaul of how Indian security forces handle complex, multi-site terrorist incidents. Mumbai proved that information warfare is just as important as firepower, and that 24-hour news cycles can accidentally become force multipliers for the enemy. Countries worldwide updated their crisis media management policies after watching terrorists use CNN and BBC as their personal tactical feed. Industrial facilities make terrible hostage crisis locations because everything from pipes to catwalks can become a death trap when bullets start flying. Militants linked to Al-Qaeda affiliates in Mali stormed Algeria's massive In Amenas natural gas complex, seizing a sprawling site filled with explosive hazards and hundreds of workers from dozens of countries. The plant's layout resembled a metal maze of processing equipment, storage tanks, and pressurized systems that could turn a firefight into a catastrophic industrial accident. Algerian forces launched helicopter and ground assaults over multiple days without consulting foreign governments whose citizens citizens were being held, reflecting the country's hardline stance that sovereignty trumps negotiation. The operation spiraled into chaos when militants started loading hostages onto vehicles for transport, forcing Algerian commandos to intercept convoys while avoiding friendly fire in terrain cluttered with explosive risks. Booby traps wired throughout the facility meant every door and hallway could be rigged to detonate, slowing clearing operations to a crawl. Multiple assault waves eventually retook the plant, but the price was steep. Approximately 37 to 39 foreign hostages died during the fighting, along with numerous Algerian workers. Different countries reported conflicting casualty numbers, adding confusion to an already murky situation. The In Amenas attack sent shockwaves through the global energy industry, forcing companies to completely rethink security at remote facilities in unstable regions. Algeria's refusal to negotiate or coordinate with foreign governments demonstrated their uncompromising counterterrorism doctrine, though it also strained diplomatic relationships with nations whose citizens died in the assault. The incident highlighted cross-border terrorism logistics, showing how instability in Mali could trigger attacks hundreds of miles away in Algeria. Energy companies worldwide now train security teams specifically for industrial site hostage scenarios, mapping out pipe systems and hazard zones the same way others study building floor plans. Russian special forces faced an impossible situation when Chechen militants wired Moscow's Dubrovka theater with explosives and threatened to blow up over 800 hostages if their demands weren't met. FSB Alpha and Wimpel units decided on a solution straight out of a spy thriller: pump an unknown opioid gas through the HVAC system to knock everyone unconscious before storming the building. The plan worked brilliantly in theory, incapacitating all 40 attackers who were killed during the assault while too drugged to fight back effectively. Then the medical response fell apart spectacularly. Hostages who survived the initial assault started dying in ambulances and hospitals because Russian authorities refused to disclose what chemical agent they'd used, preventing doctors from administering proper treatment. Emergency responders didn't have enough naloxone or other antidotes on hand, even if they'd known what to give, and triage centers were overwhelmed by hundreds of unconscious people who needed immediate care. Over 130 hostages died from the gas effects and inadequate medical response, turning a tactical success into a humanitarian disaster. The theater siege sparked worldwide controversy about using incapacitating agents in counterterrorism operations. Russia's secrecy about the gas composition meant toxicologists couldn't study its effects or develop better protocols for future incidents. The operation proved that having a magic knockout tool means nothing without the medical infrastructure to handle mass casualties afterward. Military planners learned the hard way that the care chain after an assault is just as critical as the kill chain during it. Dubrovka fundamentally changed how nations approach chemical intervention in hostage situations, with most countries deciding the risks outweigh potential benefits. The twin timelines of tactical assault and medical response have to sync perfectly, or you end up saving hostages from terrorists only to lose them to poor emergency care. Russia achieved its immediate goal of retaking the theater, but the massive civilian death toll from the gas itself made victory feel hollow. American special operators rehearsed the Entebbe prison raid so obsessively that they could navigate the compound blindfolded, practicing every movement until muscle memory took over. The Joint Air Force and Army mission planned to hint for a deliberate helicopter crash landing right in the prison courtyard, a controlled collision that would put troops exactly where they needed to be in seconds. 28 aircraft formed a massive support package with fighter escorts and attack planes ready to suppress North Vietnamese defenses, creating layers of air cover that would shield the rescue force during their 27 minutes on target. Every detail was choreographed down to the second, with full-scale mock-ups built stateside so teams could train on perfect replicas of the prison layout. The assault went off almost flawlessly, except for one catastrophic problem. The prisoners weren't there anymore. Intelligence had failed to detect that POWs had been relocated months before the raid, leaving the rescue force storming an empty compound. The opening also hit a snag when helicopters initially approached the wrong building nearby, costing precious seconds before redirecting to the actual target. Once inside the correct compound, operators executed textbook room clearing and fought off North Vietnamese guards before realizing they were rescuing ghosts. The extraction worked perfectly despite heavy surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft fire during the flight out, proving the tactics were solid even if the intelligence wasn't. Entebbe became known as the successful failure that revolutionized American special operations despite bringing home 0 POWs. The mission exposed critical gaps in intelligence gathering and led directly to the creation of modern Joint Special Operations Command, fundamentally changing how the U.S. plans and executes high-risk missions. The raid also shifted American POW policy and demonstrated that the U.S. would attempt incredibly dangerous rescues for its captured soldiers, boosting morale among prisoners who learned about the attempt later. The extreme rehearsal culture born from Entebbe became standard practice for special operations worldwide, with units now spending months training on mock-ups before hitting real targets. A hijacked Lufthansa Boeing 737 became a flying prison for 5 nightmarish days, bouncing between airports across the Middle East while terrorists made increasingly violent threats. The crisis peaked when hijackers executed the aircraft's captain and dumped his body on the tarmac in Aden, Yemen, demonstrating they'd follow through on their demands for imprisoned terrorists to be released. By the time the plane landed in Mogadishu, Somalia, West Germany's newly formed GSG-9 counterterrorism unit had tracked its movements across continents and was ready to end the standoff. 6 assault teams positioned themselves with rubber-tipped ladders that wouldn't scratch the aircraft's metal skin or make noise during approach, preparing to hit multiple doors and overwing emergency exits at exactly the same moment. British SAS advisors traveling with GSG-9 brought experimental stun grenades that would disorient the hijackers without punching holes in the pressurized fuselage. The teams worried about cockpit explosives potentially detonating during the breach, which would kill everyone in the forward section instantly. Somali Air Force pilots helped by staging decoy MiG flights that distracted the hijackers and masked the sound of GSG-9 operators getting into position around the aircraft. Just after midnight, all 6 teams breached simultaneously through doors and over-wing exits in a coordinated rush that gave terrorists no time to react. The assault freed all 87 passengers and 4 remaining crew members in minutes, with 3 hijackers killed and 1 captured before they could trigger any explosives. West Germany's refusal to negotiate during the German autumn period of terrorism was validated by the successful rescue, establishing a precedent that concessions only encouraged more attacks. The Landshut operation created the modern playbook for airline assault choreography, with specific door assignments and blind spot approaches from the aircraft tail becoming standard tactics. GSG-9's performance in Mogadishu announced that West Germany's counterterrorism capabilities had arrived on the world stage, giving the nation credibility in an arena previously dominated by British and Israeli units. The first day of school should mean new backpacks and nervous excitement, not armed terrorists herding over 1,000 children and parents into a sweltering gymnasium rigged with explosives. Chechen separatists seized School No. 1 in Beslan, North Ossetia, creating a hostage crisis so horrific that 20 years later the wounds still haven't healed. The attackers crammed hostages into the gym under hanging bombs, denying them water for days in brutal heat while negotiations went nowhere. When explosions suddenly ripped through the building on day 3, chaos erupted instantly. Nobody's entirely sure what triggered the initial blast, whether it was accidental detonation or deliberate action, but the result was immediate pandemonium. Russian forces from multiple agencies launched uncoordinated assaults without clear command structure or unified communications, turning the school into a confused battlefield. FSB and MVD troops breached from different directions simultaneously, while armed civilians joined the fight, creating deadly crossfire with terrified hostages running between shooting positions. Heavy weapons fire poured into the school from outside, collapsing walls and starting fires that trapped people inside burning classrooms. The gym became a slaughterhouse as explosions brought down the roof on packed hostages below. Rescuers and hostages alike were caught in sustained gunfights through smoke-filled hallways, making it nearly impossible to distinguish who was who. By the time the shooting stopped, roughly 334 hostages lay dead, including approximately 186 children who'd shown up expecting math class in recess. Most of the terrorists were killed during the assault, with only 1 captured alive for interrogation. Beslan stands as the deadliest school attack in history and exposed catastrophic failures in Russian crisis management. The European Court of Human Rights later ruled that Russian forces used excessive force and failed basic planning protocols, criticism that stung even more than the operational failures. Survivors carry psychological scars that mental health professionals say may never fully heal, and the annual memorial ceremonies draw international attention every September. The siege demonstrated what happens when the command-contain-assault ladder gets ignored in favor of reactive chaos. Counterterrorism instructors now use Beslan as the definitive case study of what not to do. Multiple agencies fighting over control, spontaneous breaches without coordination, and heavy firepower employed without regard for hostage safety. The tragedy proved that even with brave responders and good intentions, lack of unified command turns rescue operations into disasters. Schools worldwide overhauled their security procedures after Beslan, recognizing that soft targets filled with children require specialized planning that treats them differently from hijacked planes or embassies. The emotional weight of those 186 dead children ensures Beslan will never be forgotten, serving as a permanent reminder that botched hostage rescues don't just fail, they become generational trauma. Saturday afternoon shopping at Nairobi's upscale Westgate Mall turned into 4 days of urban warfare when Al-Shabaab militants stormed the building with assault rifles and grenades on September 21st. The attack wasn't a quick hit and run, but a deliberate siege, with terrorists fortifying positions inside the multi-level complex and settling in for a prolonged standoff. What made Westgate unique was how the initial response came not from specialized units, but from armed civilians and off-duty security personnel who happened to be nearby when the shooting started. These improvised rescue teams, including figures like Abdul Haji, who became national heroes, formed ad hoc tactical stacks and escorted terrified families through gunfire before professional forces even arrived on scene. Once official responders showed up, things got messy fast. Police General Service Unit Recce Squad and Kenya Defense Forces both wanted control of the operation, leading to a turf war that cost precious time and coordination. The command confusion created a friendly fire incident that killed responders, and militants were able to resupply from weapon caches they'd apparently pre-positioned inside the mall. Television crews broadcasting live from outside inadvertently gave attackers real-time intelligence about security force positions, forcing authorities to eventually shut down media access. The attackers had prepared for a long fight, and the lack of unified command played right into their hands. Security forces spent days clearing the massive complex room by room, isolating sections while trying to locate both hostages and militants in a building filled with hiding spots. A major explosion and partial structural collapse on the final day signaled the endgame, and by September 24th, authorities declared the mall secure with all attackers dead. The final death toll reached approximately 67 victims, a number that shocked Kenya and drew international attention. Al-Shabaab framed the attack as payback for Kenya's military involvement in Somalia under African Union peacekeeping operations, giving the mall siege serious geopolitical weight beyond just terrorism. Westgate forced Kenya to completely overhaul its crisis response protocols, establishing clearer interagency command structures and media management policies. The siege demonstrated that even well-intentioned armed civilians can't replace coordinated professional response, and that turf battles between security agencies literally get people killed. The lessons learned at Westgate now inform how African nations approach complex urban terror attacks, emphasizing that unified command isn't optional when lives hang in the balance.